20,000 years ago, at the edge of an Ice Age forest, a fire burns low. Something is watching from just past the light. Not hunting, not hiding, just staying. That single choice is the first chapter of one of the strangest partnerships in the history of life on Earth. Ask most people how this happened, how an animal that hunts in packs and can bring down a moose became an animal that sleeps at the foot of your bed, and you'll get roughly the same story every time. Some prehistoric hunter found an orphaned wolf pup, took pity on it, raised it by hand, and it grew up loyal, and generation by generation, humans tamed the wolf into a dog. Simple, tidy, feels obviously true. Except when researchers who spend entire careers studying domestication actually look closely at this story, it starts to fall apart. Wolves are not naturally arranged to become the family pet just by being raised close to people. Does your dog act like a wolf sometimes? Share your funny stories on the comment section. Wildlife biologists who have hand-raised wolf pups from birth, bottle-fed them, slept beside them, treated them exactly like a litter of Labrador puppies, report the same outcome again and again. Around a certain age, something changes. The wolf becomes independent, sometimes aggressive, resistant to the basic social deference that even a poorly trained dog shows almost by instinct. Raising a wolf like a dog does not produce a dog. It produces a wolf that had an unusual childhood. So if hand-raising alone doesn't explain it, something else has to. To find that something else, you have to go to Siberia, to a research institute outside the city of Novosibirsk, and to a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev. In 1959, Belyaev started an experiment that was, by any measure, a strange thing to spend a career on. He wasn't working with wolves. He was working with silver foxes, farmed for their pelts, an animal that behaves toward humans roughly the way a wild fox does, skittish, defensive, unwilling to be touched. Belyaev's question was simple and enormous at the same time. What if you bred foxes for exactly one trait, and only one trait? Calmness around humans. Not size. Not coat color. Not intelligence. Just tameness. How fast would something like domestication actually happen if you selected for the single quality that seems to matter most? Each generation, he and his research partner, a young scientist named Ludmila Trut, tested fox pups for how they reacted to a human hand reaching toward the cage. The calmest, least fearful individuals were bred forward. Everything else stayed as it was. Within fewer than 10 generations, tame foxes started to appear, foxes that would approach the researchers, wag their tails, seek contact. That part was expected. What nobody fully expected was what happened to their bodies. Without anyone selecting for it, the tame foxes started developing floppy ears instead of upright ones. Their tails curled instead of staying straight. Patches of white and brown appeared in coats that used to be a uniform silver. Their snouts shortened. Some even began to bark, a sound wild foxes essentially do not make. Trut continued the project for decades, and it is still running today, having produced an entire population of foxes that look, in almost every visible way, like small, floppy-eared dogs. They were selected for one invisible trait, an easier relationship with fear, and their physical bodies rearranged themselves to match it. Trut's team also tracked what was happening inside the tame foxes, not just what was visible on the outside. Blood tests across the generations showed steadily dropping levels of the stress hormone cortisol and rising levels of serotonin, the kind of internal chemical shift you'd expect in an animal that experiences the world as less threatening, generation after generation, without ever being taught to feel that way. The calm wasn't just behavioral, it had sunk into their biology. For a long time, this was treated as a curiosity, a strange side effect nobody could fully explain. Then in 2014, a group of researchers proposed a genetic explanation that ties it all together, centered on a type of cell present very early in the development of every mammal embryo, called the neural crest cell. Neural crest cells are extraordinary. They form early, then migrate outward across the developing embryo, and give rise to a strange combination of tissues that don't seem related on the surface. Pigment cells in the skin and fur, cartilage in the ears and tail, structures in the jaw and skull, and the adrenal glands, the organs responsible for producing the hormones behind the fight-or-flight response. The theory goes like this. Selecting an animal for reduced fear and reduced stress reactivity is, at a biological level, selecting for a milder adrenal response. And because the very same developmental cells that build the adrenal system also build ear cartilage, tail structure, and coat pigmentation, dialing down one system quietly drags the others along with it. You are not just breeding a calmer temperament. You are, without meaning to, reaching into the blueprint of the entire animal and nudging dozens of traits at once, because underneath the skin they were never actually separate systems. Floppy ears and curly tails were never the goal. They were the accidental fingerprint left behind by selecting for calm. Which brings us to the real question this raises. If the foxes in Siberia only changed because scientists deliberately chose which ones bred, who was doing the choosing 20 or 30,000 years ago, when there were no labs, no researchers, no clipboards? Who was selecting wolves for tameness before humans had any concept of selective breeding at all? This is where a different, and in some ways more compelling, explanation enters the story. Some researchers, including biologist Raymond Coppinger, argued that humans may not have done the choosing at all, not directly, not on purpose. Early human camps, wherever they were, produced waste: bones, scraps, discarded organs, the leftover material from every kill and every meal. That waste created something new in the landscape, a stable, predictable, low-effort source of calories sitting at the edge of human settlements. Most wolves would never approach that closely. Their instinctive flight distance, the space they need to keep between themselves and something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous, is simply too wide, usually somewhere between 100 and several hundred meters for an adult wolf encountering humans. Cross that threshold and the wolf runs, no matter how much food is sitting there. But a wolf born with a slightly shorter flight distance, a slightly calmer stress response, could tolerate being nearer to the noise and unpredictability of a human camp long enough to feed on what was left behind. That wolf spent less energy running, took in more calories, and was more likely to survive and reproduce than its more cautious relatives. Generation after generation, that small advantage compounded. The wolves comfortable enough to stay near the edges of human life quietly out-reproduced the wolves that kept their distance. Nobody was choosing puppies. Nobody was breeding anything on purpose. A population of wolves was simply selecting itself, one cautious or fearless individual at a time, for a niche that happened to exist right beside us. If this version of events is closer to what actually happened, it changes the entire framing of the story. We didn't go looking for a wolf to tame. A version of the wolf went looking for us, and the ones who could tolerate our company were the ones who got to keep coming back. So when did this actually happen? This is one of the more contested questions in the field, and depending on which genetic study you read, the answer shifts. Ancient DNA pulled from wolf and early dog remains across Siberia and Europe has produced estimates placing the split somewhere between roughly 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, with some genomic analyses pushing the earliest edge even further back. What almost every version of the timeline agrees on, though, is the part that tends to surprise people most. This happened well before agriculture, before permanent villages, before humans had domesticated a single plant or any other animal. Dogs were not a byproduct of farming. Dogs came first, sometimes by tens of thousands of years, born out of small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers and a population of wolves willing to live at the edge of their firelight. And once this partnership started, it moved fast, by evolutionary standards, and it moved everywhere. Geneticist Adam Boyko and colleagues have spent years studying what are known as village dogs, the free-ranging, mixed ancestry dogs found in nearly every inhabited region on Earth, from rural villages in Africa and Southeast Asia to the outskirts of cities in South America. Their genetic patterns show that dogs weren't domesticated once and then slowly exported. They traveled with the people who kept them, migration by migration, continent by continent. Dog remains dating back roughly 10,000 years have been found as far into the Americas as Illinois, meaning dogs were already fully established companions before some of those human populations had even finished settling a new hemisphere. Dogs became, by a wide margin, the first domesticated species on the planet, arriving thousands of years before the first domesticated sheep, the first domesticated wheat, the first domesticated anything else. And here is where the story stops being just about genetics and starts being about something closer to feeling. In the late 1800s, near the German city of Bonn, a burial site was uncovered containing the remains of a man, a woman, and, laid alongside them, the skeleton of a dog. Later dating placed the burial at roughly 14,000 years old, from a period when the last glaciers were still retreating across Europe. For over a century, the dog was simply catalogued as part of the grave. Then, in 2018, a team of researchers took a closer look at the animal's teeth and bones and found something nobody expected. The dog, based on growth patterns in its enamel, had contracted canine distemper as a young puppy, a viral illness that is frequently fatal and, even in survivors, typically causes weeks of severe vomiting, fever, and an inability to eat normally. Left alone, an infected wolf pup in the wild would almost certainly have died within days. This puppy did not die within days. The dental evidence suggested it survived for months after infection, which researchers argued would have required near-constant care. Someone keeping it warm, someone providing food it could actually keep down, someone simply refusing to let it die, at a point in its short life when it offered no protection, no help hunting, no obvious use of any kind. Whoever cared for that puppy did it, as far as the evidence can tell, for no practical reason at all. They kept it alive because they wanted to, and when it eventually died, it was buried beside them, not discarded, buried, as if it belonged there. While the archaeology was uncovering what happened to the body, a separate line of research was uncovering what happened to the mind. In the early 2000s, researcher Brian Hare, working alongside Michael Tomasello, ran a deceptively simple test. Hide food under one of two cups, then point at the correct one. See if the animal can use that gesture to find the food. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, animals capable of tool use and complex problem solving, are surprisingly bad at this task. Wolves, even wolves raised from birth by humans, are also bad at it. Dogs, including puppies only a few weeks old with almost no training and no prior exposure to the test, solved it easily, following a human point to the correct cup at rates that stunned the researchers running the experiment. It wasn't that dogs were smarter overall. On most measures of general problem solving, wolves and dogs perform similarly, and chimpanzees outperform both. Dogs had instead developed something oddly specific, an intense, almost involuntary sensitivity to human communicative signals. A pointed finger, a glance, a shift in posture towards something. Where a wolf sees an arm gesture, a dog appears to see information, meant for them, worth acting on. That is not a trait ancient wolves needed to survive in a pack hunting elk. It is a trait that only makes sense if survival started depending, at least partly, on understanding what a human was trying to tell you. The body kept changing too, in ways written directly into the genetic code. In 2013, a team led by geneticist Eric Axelson compared the genomes of dogs and wolves and found a striking difference in a gene called AMY2B, which controls the production of an enzyme that breaks down starch in the small intestine. Dogs, on average, carry far more copies of this gene than wolves, sometimes many times more, allowing them to digest starchy food dramatically more efficiently. Wolves are built to process meat. A diet heavy in grain, root vegetables, or the carbohydrate-rich scraps found around human settlements is not something their digestive system handles particularly well. Dogs, over thousands of years of eating what people ate, or what people threw away, appear to have genetically adapted to exactly that shift, extra copies of a single gene, quietly multiplying generation after generation, until an entire species carried the biochemical memory of a diet built around us. You can trace human food waste directly into the digestive machinery of a dog's small intestine. That is not a metaphor for coevolution. That is coevolution, written in enzymes. Put all of it together: the Siberian foxes, the neural crest cells, The wolves at the edge of the firelight. The sick puppy someone refused to let die. The pointed finger a dog understands without being taught. The extra copies of a starch-digesting gene. And a much stranger picture appears than the one about a hunter finding a cute pup in the woods. Nobody sat down and decided to invent the dog. Nobody bred the first one on purpose. A population of wild animals over tens of thousands of years kept making one small choice, generation after generation. Stay close, tolerate the noise, tolerate the smell, tolerate the strange upright creatures around the fire, in exchange for a slightly easier life. And every time they made that choice, their bodies and their brains shifted a little further away from the wolf, and a little closer to something new. We didn't domesticate the wolf. Some wolves domesticated themselves into us, and in doing it, they rewrote nearly everything about what they were. Their faces, their guts, their nervous systems, their entire relationship with fear, just to stay near a fire that was never theirs to begin with. So go back to that fire, 20 or 30,000 years ago, to the animal at the edge of the light, watching, not hunting, not hiding, just staying. It had no way of knowing what that choice would become. It didn't know it was starting a lineage that would eventually sleep in houses, ride in cars, and press its head into the hand of a stranger halfway across the planet, in a species that hadn't been invented yet, on a continent it would never see. It just knew that, for tonight, it was a little warmer near the fire than it was out in the dark. That was enough. That was the whole decision. And somehow, that is still the reason a dog is lying near your feet right now. Every video uncovers something new. Like and subscribe so you can be part of the next journey.